I've been hard at work improving the art and visuals for my indie game, Moonshire. Slowly, over the course of development, the game has been looking better and better. I still think it has a long way to go, but I've made some recent updates that really help bring the game to life. First off, I've been putting in a bunch of objects that you can interact with. This is inspired by the Souls series, where you can roll into boxes and furniture to break them. There's not much of a point to this, but it is really satisfying. It also adds some immersion, since it'd be really strange if the furniture was indestructible. As I was decorating my game's interior areas with new assets, I was originally placing furniture in as tiles, where they were static and behaved the same as walls. At some point I stopped and switched over to making everything into a movable and destructible object. I can assign a specific mass to any particular object, and that impacts how easily the player can push it around. When you break something, it generates a bunch of particles that linger on the ground, so you can admire all the destruction that you've caused. Objects like these are going to be everywhere, and the system I created makes it really easy to add new props whenever I want. I also made sure everything runs efficiently, even when tons of destruction particles are being generated. Everything has its own collision for a little bit in order to collide with any walls, but once the particle stops moving, the collision deletes itself. I'd like to incorporate these same kinds of particles into other parts of the game, like when you defeat enemies. In addition to these updates, I've been working on adding more movement to the environment. For example, the water has animated tiles that's much nicer to look at compared to how it looked originally. Certain areas have simple weather effects like rain particles that fall from the sky or a fog texture that moves across the screen. Combining these things together makes the environment look a lot more alive, but recently I've taken it a step further. Throughout the game, there's plenty of larger props or decorations like these streetlights or all of the trees in each map. I think the sprites themselves look nice, but it also looks really stiff, having a bunch of unmoving, static trees scattered around. I'd like everything to be more like these banners, which wave in the wind. Creating a good animation like this for a tree was tricky, because I wanted the movement to be somewhat subtle. What I ended up doing was dividing the sprite into sections and moved each section one at a time, which adds a ripple effect. It's smooth, but with a bunch of trees, I still think this is too distracting for something that's just an environment decoration. I went back and simplified it down to only 3 sections, and this is what I landed on. I went through the same process with the big tree as well, but I separated it into layers to make each branch have its own movement. I like these loops because it feels like a windy day, and the petals that float by help to visually indicate this. If you're ever repeating a bunch of the same animations next to each other, one thing to look out for is the frames syncing up exactly. It sort of breaks immersion when this happens, but if you put a little bit of randomness on the time spent on each frame, everything will have its own slightly different animation speed. I wanted to incorporate this wind into the audio mix as well. I added a new category of sound effect for weather, so this can be adjusted at any time, and each area will have some weather sounds to supplement the music and regular sound effects. Here's the wind weather. And I did this with the rain a long time ago, but I properly added it to the mix now as well. All of these changes so far have helped a lot with bringing the environment to life, and the next step was to add more things actually living in this environment. Enemies and plants were a good first step, but I wanted more NPCs, or people living in the town that the player could talk with. Ellie sprites helped with designing some more people, and now that the game is further along in development and has more features, I was able to come up with meaningful things for each of them to say. Either some small lore details, tutorials, or actual guidance on where to go. I've been thinking very carefully about how to design the layout of the first 10 minutes of the game. These early moments are crucial for providing that good first impression, and these environmental changes are just one aspect of that good experience. The world layout and actual progression of the player is another that I've been reworking. I've realized after watching tons of people play the demo that the game should be a bit more linear before branching out into a bunch of options for places to go. Originally, the game was designed where, right away, the player could go into town, or they could explore the cave, or they could go fight this flower boss, all before talking to anyone or having any noteworthy experience. It felt too aimless, where I didn't provide any sort of motivation or guidance to do anything in particular. Rather than jumping straight into a bunch of options, I've narrowed the focus of the very first sections to introduce aspects of the game one by one. The early tutorials are the same, but the path now leads into a forced enemy encounter, and this is now the first challenge for every player. This is important because I can balance this fight using only the mechanics I've introduced so far. The goal is to teach new mechanics slowly, so the player can pick up on the details over time without being overwhelmed all at once. You can still heal and dodge if you know how to, but it's not explicitly mentioned until a little bit later. Once you're in town, seeing all the NPCs really does add a lot of life to the area. But also, I've given them dialogue that gives a sense of purpose to what the players should be doing, as well as directions on where they can go next if they need it. It's at this point that the options start to open up, and there's actual motivation for doing each one. I think this updated layout is much better in terms of getting players ramped up in the game. It also makes a town feel like a place you might want to return back to, since you can follow up on certain tasks and possibly earn rewards for your work. Since returning to town is something I'm encouraging players to do, I'd like it to feel a bit different every time you return. As the story progresses and you meet new characters, I'd like some of them to reappear in town, like this Tengu who shows up after completing the Cloud Dungeon. There's an outdoor merchant, and I'd like it where maybe halfway through the game, she's able to build a proper shop using the money that you spent there, or maybe from other related side quests. In general, I like the idea of the number of NPCs starting small at first and increasing over the course of the game. That way you're not overwhelmed with too many people at first where you end up sick of just reading dialogue. Like I mentioned earlier, there's still lots of room for improvement. If you have any suggestions for things I could do to improve the visuals, please let me know, since that's one of the most challenging aspects of game development for me. Moonshire has a free demo on Steam, and adding it to your wishlist is an amazing way to support the project. The link to the Discord server is in the description, and thank you so much for taking the time to watch this video.